For those of y'all who don't know me, I'm Sarah Rapana, and I teach English classes, and I am here to introduce Adam Vines, our poet of the evening. I've known Adam for about 15 years, we've decided, and he's legit one of my favorite poets. I'll just give you a little bit of information about him. I'll tell you a little bit about what I think of his poetry, and then he will read the poetry to you. I would like you to keep in mind that afterwards you can purchase 3 of his 4 books of poetry. Look at them. Aren't they beautiful? I have all of them. I recommend all of them. Okay. So, Adam Vines, you were both born and raised in Alabama, am I correct about that?
Yes.
Born and raised in Alabama, continues to live in Alabama. He has a background, you owned a landscaping business?
For 20 years.
For 20 years, this man owned a landscaping business and ran a landscaping business. He has a very, very just sort of a varied background. And actually my main memories of Adam from grad school is that we all shared, 700 of us graduate assistants shared this office that was at the top of a tower in Florida, and it was unpleasant. There were all these desks sort of jammed together and computers from 1990 and stuff. And every single time I walked into that office, Adam Vines was there. And one day I was like, dude, you are literally always here. If you're not teaching, you're here. And he was like, yeah, I come in at 8, I work until 5. It's a work day, right? And I was like, damn, that's why his poetry's so good. And that's what I learned from Adam Vines, right? The man shows up, he does the work, and it shows. He's got 4 books, 2 written by just himself, and 2 more written in collaboration with a legit Cirque du Soleil acrobat. So that's impressive. You've co-written books on climate change with a naturalist? With a polar biologist, goes to Antarctica to work on those, faced off with a leopard seal. Turns out a leopard seal is like a giant creature that has venom teeth. Did y'all see Venom?
Yes. Yeah.
Did you see the teeth?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, like that. So, legit, for real. I'll tell you, it's real. I have seen him, and I've also seen pictures that he does this more often than just the times that I have gone. He takes people on wilderness walks, and they've only gotten lost 2-3 times, and everybody made it back out of the wilderness again. He's a champion of the land. He's a champion of poets. He edits Birmingham Poetry Review, which, it's always been a great review, but before Adam Vines took over, it was a small, sort of little publication, and now it's one of the thickest and best and most exciting publications in America. He is a professor at University of Alabama, Birmingham. He just won a fancy award for Out of Speech, his latest book, from me. I wrote it down. Alabama Poetry Society's 2018 Book of the Year. So, none of the rest of us could say that. Thank you. Yeah. And what I really want you to concentrate on tonight, though, is Adam Vines' poetry. So I think about poetry, good poetry, as being about tension, right? You're creating a tension between language and image, between one kind of image and another kind of image. You're creating drama with tension. And the way that Adam Vines creates tension in his poems is just really amazing. They're really, really perfectly balanced. When I said that Adam Vines shows up for work every day, his work has sort of a craftsman's attention to detail and to technique. But a lot of times when people are really, really virtuosic with technique, for me, they sort of lose the heart a little bit, right? But Adam Vines does not lose the heart. His work uses that sort of really great meter and that really great sort of traditional poetry technique to really show you his heart and to really, like, it's really empathetic work, whether he's writing about an elegy for his friend with fishing imagery, or he's writing a poem about throwing tampons in the toilet. Are you reading that one tonight?
I'll read it first thing just for you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Or he's responding to a Matisse painting, right? They're like all really, like, he's elevating these really grounded things with beautiful language, but he's also grounding this beautiful language with, just like the best parts of the magic of our mundane lives, if that makes sense. Even if it doesn't make sense, that's what I think he's doing. So, are y'all ready?
Yeah.
Are y'all really excited? Okay, Adam Hines.
Thanks for coming out, everybody. It's freezing here. I'm a country boy. Couldn't y'all do something about this cold weather just for me? I went out this morning, 6 o'clock, went to the Y, worked out, and I thought, I'm going to go for a nice walk. Then the wind hits, and it moves through you. It doesn't just hit you, it moves through you. Yeah, so I stayed inside next to my little space heater after that, like a little chihuahua. Well, I will read the poem that Sarah talked about first. It's from my first collection. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. My father was a bricklayer. I come from a coal mining background, 2 generations of coal miners. I started a landscape business when I was 18. Went to school part-time. Took me 10 years to do my undergraduate degree. Don't ever do that. Finish. But it's because I worked 50 hours a week. I grew up with 3 brothers, my mother and my father, and we lived in about a 1,200 square foot house, 2-bedroom. I lived on the screened-in porch, but in Alabama you can do such a thing. But imagine in the mornings, when everybody's trying to get ready to go to school and there's 4 boys, and we go into that bathroom. There's 1 on the pot, there's 1 in the sink, and there's 2 in the bathtub. And there's my mother sitting outside of that bathroom going, well, I remember being in that bathroom, and in the bathroom you've got the toilet here. It was a little tiny bathroom, toilet here. You've got the sink here, and it's just a stand-up sink. And there's no place to put your toothbrush or anything, so we had to be really creative. You know, there's no vanity, there's nothing in below it. And I remember looking next to the toilet, and they were my mother's feminine products. And I didn't know that they were feminine products at the time, but God, there was this beautiful blue box with these 40 things sticking out of it. They were like Lincoln logs. I didn't have Lincoln logs. I was like, hell, I could build a house with these things. But I didn't know what they were. But I knew that no one talked about it. I had no idea what to do with them. So one morning, I opened one up. It changed my life forever. Toilet flowers. You can imagine where this is going. And I may know more about the history of tampons than any human being on earth. I spent 4 months researching the history of tampons. So don't say that poets just gaze into their navels. We do research just like fiction writers do. Egyptian women tied papyrus fibers into Isis knots, damming the moon blood, the open wound from Thoth. And farther east, girls watched their mothers wrapping theirs out of the same thin paper from which they folded swans. And later, a man designed the catamenial monthly device, and a man called it tampion, a plug for a cannon, keeping out dust and moisture. Did y'all know that? Only a man would call it a tampion, a plug for a cannon. My God. My high school girlfriend called it George. She'd say, George is in town this week, when I walked my fingers up her thigh. But at 10, I knew none of this. They sat in an open box next to the toilet I shared with my 3 brothers, father, and mother. They didn't come with mother's warnings or reprimands like, don't sword fight with a plunger, blank will kill you, blank will make you go blind. I knew they were for her, all else was a mystery. So one Sunday morning while my family still slept, I latched the bathroom door, peeled back the wrapper as if it were a popsicle, and held the plunger, a cannon, a gun barrel. I pulled on the string, holding the pledget like a mouse by its tail. I smelled it, pressed my thumbnail into its soft density, placed it on the sconce like a candle. Pretending to light it, I threw it into the tub like an M80. Imagine Gabriel or Michael lighting the fuse with the red punk of their pupils, then tossing the pure white scourge at Satan. Open another, then 3, 4, more and more, holding them in the corner by mouth while squinting one eye like my father chewing his cigar, tucking them like grenades into the waistband of my skivvies. One fell into the toilet and slowly opened like a moonflower, burgeoning to life the way I imagined the sea monkeys and ads on the back cover of our comics would. I dropped all of them in, one by one, watching as they bloomed in the bowl. My mother's footsteps, her voice behind the door, and I flushed them. The water rose, spilling over the porcelain lip, and when I faced my mother, the bathroom now flooded. I felt shame for her secret I thought I now knew, for the beauty I had created and the sin of creating it. Adama, Adam, me, bloody lump. A lot of that's autobiography. I always tell my students, and I have to tell myself all the time, that we can't strictly adhere to autobiography. We've got to do what's best for the poem sometimes. But I think that the spirit of this poem resides in the fact that my mother never told anyone. She helped me clean up the bathroom so quickly and didn't let my brothers find out about it. I had these 2 awful pot-smoking 70s brothers who'd come rolling in their Trans Am and use me as a toy. And she knew that if they found out that I was playing with tampons and flooded the bathroom, that I'd catch hell in this kind of hyper-masculine, problematic Southern childhood. And she saw that coming. And that was a secret that we kept. And it's something that I think made me tender later in life. At least I hope so. I'm going to read some work from a new manuscript that I'm almost finished with. These are autobiographical poems too. Since I started with this one, I figure I'll read some elegies. This is an elegy for a close friend of mine who passed a couple of years ago. Lures. Last summer's fishing failures dangled from trees. A rapala and jitterbug a stand of privet paid for. Half-ounce jigs with rubber skirts, and jelly worms with wide gap hooks on 10-pound tests. We tithed with overzealous casts at bass. Then off we'd go, our stringers bare, to find a yard to cut, a truck to wash, so we could fill our tackle box we shared again. Today is 12-12-12, the Mayan end, and I, a country boy in Brooklyn for the week, will hail a cab for the first time and think of cows unnerved by fish we missed, and shouts of shit that followed, and dawns to dusks and always back with you, my childhood friend. Our girls will never know that pond's deep hole a baseball diamond now fills, the city leader's bright idea, or how their fathers, sitting in the bleachers on Saturdays a couple decades later, can almost feel the stinging nettle against their thighs, the lunker largemouth sweeping the bed with her tail, while plastic lizards jerk and drag across the third base line. Or how when we untrain our ears to baseball's cracking bats and bitchy parents, called strikes and alike, we hear the peepers sounding off in oaks on down the way. Our mothers' and fathers' voices calling us home, not too far behind or ahead. That poem and this next poem, both elegies, I wrote when I was in New York doing research for the book that I'm going to read out of in a minute. It was really the first time I'd been in a big city on my own. Sadly, I was 40-something years old. But I remember I was scared shitless going to New York, as most people are. And I got out and I said, I'm going to hail a cab. And I tried to hail a cab and I couldn't get a cab to stop. I had no idea what the lights on top meant. I thought they knew that I was a fool and they weren't going to stop for me. So I walked 90 blocks that day. And it was the very best thing for me that I ever could have done. Because I would slip in and get coffee somewhere, slip into a bookstore. I was hearing 4 or 5 different languages on the street corners. It was bewildering and empowering. And it's what I needed. And I walked up to Museum Mile and then walked into the museum for the first time, and I wrote my first poem for this collection. But while I was there, I had a friend who was very sick. He had a glioblastoma and he was dying. And also a good friend of mine who was going to come in town, a poet, Jake Adam York, who's from Alabama, had a stroke and died while I was there. There was also the shooting at the elementary school that week, and I had a 5-6-year-old. So it was just a traumatic and overpowering week for me. But at night, somehow I wrote these elegies, and they almost came out fully formed. And I'm not sure, those gifts happen, but they don't happen often. River Elegy for Jake Adam York. Yesterday, snow, not stars, fell on Alabama. But on my slow jam home over Red Mountain, behind a streak of bread and milk-stocked cars, chalked by a field of white, I can't keep from humming the tune over and over, replacing stars with snow. Tomorrow I would have driven past Tuxedo Junction, where Erskine Hawkins might have brassed those stars 75 years ago in Ensley, and over viaducts beneath which hoggers haven't hung rails with black snakes or pig iron cars in decades, and foundry molds haven't flushed orange for just as long. And on to the sticks through hollers where my kin ripped seams of coal and piled spoils in rippling rows, healing pulp pines in their stead. And on to beat 10 of the Warrior River, where fish camps outnumber churches, where a man stepping on another man's land might see a lightning still hunkered into a bank, or just how deep that river channel is. And on to the dirt road's end, where my kin crawled out of the river, where I would have cut and split a seasoned turkey oak for your visit and piled rocks for a pit closer to the slough. So when we would have run and relivered that trot line by the skinny moon, we'd have fire close when we sculled back to the bank. Then over a skillet of skeeting willicap fillets, I would have mentioned the rendition still stuck in my head even today, Fitzgerald and Armstrong's and the absurd snow. And you would have gone on about you, an Alabama privet switch driving through Colorado on winter days. And I bet I would have learned from you on that night that will never be what I had to learn on my own today. That Holiday and Coltrane flirted through that number too. And the song owes its breath to the 1833 Leonid's meteor shower, the night the stars fell. And I imagine you would have said what I am thinking now, that a shower of 33 happens only once every couple of lifetimes, and even then, it won't happen if you ain't paying attention. My daughter, I said this earlier, I have a really precocious 10-year-old. Every time I go read somewhere, she says, "Daddy, you gonna read poems about me?" And I said, "Honey, I'll read a poem about you." She said, "No, you've got to read all poems about me." The beauty of being a narcissist at 10. I'm going to read 2 or 3 poems about my daughter, and then I'll read one from Out of Speech. This Little Piggy. Like a cat lured by its tail, my daughter doesn't yet know her feet are hers. She chews and slobbers on these strange orphans, slaps them together as a punished student would, chalkboard erasers. In her crib, hands clasp feet in a spire of unstable flesh. Then she plops to one side, looks at me, then doesn't, through the bars as I kneel. And I see clearly that the red in my beard is the red in her curls, but also that my daughter is not mine. That love is not possession or a mere pronoun or an apostrophe in the sympathetic system of language. That one day she will realize that her feet conform to her will, her heart, and she will walk away from me. She also asks these extraordinary questions, and I've got a suite of poems about questions that she asks. I read 2 of these earlier, and I'm going to read them again. One was after the women's marches across America, and she watched them with us as an 8-year-old, and we talked to her about first and second and third wave feminism, of which she, I'm sure, didn't understand much. But we also talked about why all of these women were out, what were the issues, and she asked a lot of questions that night. Well, every morning I go in and wake her up, and it's before it's light outside. And many mornings she'll ask me a question. She'll say, I've been thinking about this all night, Daddy, and I thought about it in my dreams, blah, blah, blah. Generally, it's a question that you can't even start to answer in the morning when you're trying to get a child ready for school. This one, I had no idea how to answer a question like this. Morning question in bed after the women's marches across America. Do we deserve to live, you ask? Not do we live or how we live, those I have stumbled through before. Dawn reticulating light through blinds, across the beds I built for your dolls. Before I trip into an answer, some softened Hume or backwoods Joe, or try to squeeze from you the doubt. You blurt out pilot's wife, the dream she had, what you recall from Sunday's service. You say that you woke up last night from dreams of women dressed in white while standing in the streets. And as the light reveals your face, a bar across your mouth and one across your eyes, your words dissolve, reform into a wrinkled sheet of light I lift above my head to hear and see beneath 3 million chant in unison. Our bodies are not yours. You ask what is our only comfort in. I can't respond. I hide my face. And us, you say for me, with fortitude and grace. Question from a bowl of beans. A bite of beans, a long milk draw, and then a side glance. What's it like to be a boy? She asked. Tiresias first came to mind, the mating snakes he struck, the female dead, his 7 years in women's flesh that followed. Didacticism at its worst, I thought. Especially how to explain his lie to Hera, pleasures of the we and woo and homosocial bonds, the kind of myth an 8-year-old like mine would dig, then dig at me until I broke, explaining different parts in Dumbass Boys, the Birds and Bees. My wife was teaching dance that night and would have struck me blind if it had gone that way. Instead, I merely said, it ain't that bad. A lie, of course, then took another bite of beans. The penis seems to be a lot of trouble, she said, while looking down into her bowl. And once again, I thought, deflect. I could bring Nana into play, and how at 8 I told my class about my front tail, unzipped my pants to show them when they said I lied. Miss Walker screamed the long walk down the hall, how Nana let me think I had a tail for years, until that day when I walked home and Daddy told me about the penis, the stiff-tailed ways. I knew it ain't that bad would hardly do for this. I said, you're right, it is a lot of trouble. Stay away. Yeah, this is what I'm an old daddy. This is what I have in store for me. This is an elegy for my father. My father's rod, fishing the skinny moon. While waiting on the Appaloosa bite, our channel cats would do. Our fingertips plucking our fishing lines below the first eyes. Twitching livers we had hooked and cast into the river's crawl. My father would relax, the only time I witnessed this. He'd stretch his legs and dig his heels and match a lucky strike to life. He'd drag and exhale that the night had pocketed the moon. The cats would bite. We'd be all right. I'd dig in deep like him and hum a hymn I still don't know the name of, nor did he, I don't believe. But in that dark, that settling loam, and that Alabama clay, that hymn was ours, and God was there or not. It didn't matter. The bills were paid, he held his rod, he'd be all right. All right, I'm going to read some painting poems. These are all ekphrastic poems. Ekphrastic is a fancy Greek word that means, guess what? Out of speech. God, I'm so clever stealing that. But ek means out, phrasis or phrase, speech, creating art out of speech in an oral tradition. These are poems about visual art. I was lucky enough to acquire grants where I could travel all over the country. So I drafted all of the poems for this collection while I was in front of the actual art piece. Sometimes I would spend 8 or 10 hours in front of, one Kandinsky, or in front of a Rothko. Or I spent 2 days in Rothko Chapel in Houston. But I went to Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, New York. New York, I went to Frick Guggenheim, the Met, the Whitney, and MoMA. Where else? God, 7 or 8 places in the States, Spain, France, and the last poem takes place in Argentina when I was on the way to Antarctica. It's a great passage. But I was interested in seeing the art firsthand. I'd written some ekphrastic poems before, and the problem that I found was that without having the full scale, without being able to see the true color, without being able to see the texture, without being able to follow the kind of narrative arc that I'm so interested in when it comes to, say, an Edward Hopper painting, without seeing it beside other paintings or complementary paintings, without being in the kind of social atmosphere of the museum that I was so interested in. And these were theoretical notions that I also applied when I was writing more scholarship about Renaissance homosocial relationships. I found that in these museums, I was this excited kid wanting to talk to people about paintings, but there was a certain sterility, almost as if we were in a chapel, where people weren't allowed to talk, where they weren't allowed to giggle and interact. And also found that there were these odd moments where we would have docents who would be talking to children who should never talk to children and ruin their art experience. And there were people on dates who were speaking very loudly about what they knew about the paintings because they wanted everyone to hear, but they didn't know anything about the paintings. And then there were people who would speak aloud and they'd say things like, "Who would eat a peacock pie?" And they didn't really want anybody to answer them. But guess what? How could I miss the opportunity to do such a thing? And I'd say, I would eat that peacock pie. All those blue eyes flirting with you. And then you freak the person out. But they asked a question. They don't want an answer. So I started writing about the social atmosphere of the museum as much as the paintings. And also allowed my subjective renderings to slip in. Whatever was affecting me at the time. So I'll read some poems that stayed more in the paintings, and then poems that escape the paintings and went in other places. Having bummed a smoke outside of the National Gallery, though I've quit. It's got an epigraph from Eliot from the second section of The Wasteland. And if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess. The trees stick out their tongues at all of us, squatting at their trunks, while wild onions fall limp at their tips like month-old mohawks. Candy-coated tourist buses park toe to heel. Yesterday, sushi and a slipped-off boot and socked foot in the lap for lunch, and noodles and beef alone in Chinatown last night. Will another woman ever place her handbag on the grass, commando crawl to it, finger the stalk eye of her camera, and snap 20 shots of the Capitol dome perched upon her slouched purse like a Pope's mitre? Would Cezanne study this team of Segways rolling past with their unmanned eyes and over-ripened helmets? Would Rousseau replace the mannered Samoyed with a jeweled collar and thin leash and hook up this albino squirrel, begging for a cheese Danish instead, stroking it wild as the boy in a harness, pulling with all his strength against his mother's thick strap, the Washington Monument distending from his hunched back? Modigliani wouldn't have to stretch the mother's face beyond the long length it has become. The stoled woman reckoning a clause in the gallery asked no one out loud, who would eat a peacock pie? Here it comes. All its feathers in a vase beside it, and all of those blue eyes flirting with you, I responded, and I would. It's another pretty extraordinary experience. I had a lot of extraordinary experiences on these travels to museums. But one was an interactive art installation that was at MoMA. And it was just a pile of candy in a corner. Has anyone seen that? You see, you've got this hard candy that's wrapped up. They almost look like jewels, you know. Imagine like butterscotches, you know, with the bright orange covers on them. It's piled over in a corner, and then there's this fluorescent or this neon sign above it that says "Eat Me." And you've got this huge pile of candy, and you find out later, or if you go up and read the placard, you find out that it's 175 pounds of candy. And what are we taught when we go to museums? Don't touch a damn thing. I can hear my mother now. Don't you touch a damn thing. Why do they have that little line right there that you don't step over? It goes beep, 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 beep. And imagine those security guards staring at me for 10 hours in front of a $60 million painting. But you've got this pile of candy over there and it says, "Eat me," and everybody's kind of looking around, staring at it, but they're not going to read this. They're not going to read the artist statement, right? That's too hard. So they're kind of coursing around it, and I'm standing over the side, and then there's this wonderful woman who comes up and she's got this kind of crazy outfit on, and she's got these wonderful rainbow socks, and she comes up like this, and we're all standing there, she just goes, and walks off. And then everybody's like, oh my God. So then people are going over and getting one and grabbing it like, woohoo, look what I've seen, you know. So that went on for about 10 minutes, and I'm watching this, and it was a wonderful experience. What they didn't do is they didn't read the damn placard. The idea behind the 175 pounds is that that was the artist's lover's ideal weight. He was dying of AIDS. So the idea is it's kind of like transubstantiation. You're taking the candy in, you're bringing in the body, the host, and everyone's coming together as a community and mourning and being a part of that, right? And every day they would weigh the pile, replenish the pile back to 175 pounds. It's a beautiful notion, isn't it? Beautiful. No one knew what was going on. study of intergroup reconciliation. After Nauman's Eat Death, Gonzalez Torres's untitled Portrait of Ross in L.A., Warhol's 25 Colored Marylands, and Nolan's Blue Wall. On the fluorescent sign, I try to read his diner. Eat ripens orange as coiled eyes on a stove. Inside the D and H buttressing death. And piled beside it, hard candy like cabochon cut jewels begs us to take and eat this gift and thus diminish its ideal weight of 175 pounds. And we do. First, the woman with rainbows on her fleece socks for 3 butterscotches. Then a bald man fingers a cinnamon round and whispers a prayer, I am close enough to eat. And I bow my head and close my eyes with him. We all eat and eat and eat, the spicy, the sweet, like what took the artist's love from him, and wait for the replenished pile his statement promises. 25 Marylands nod and lip from the next room, lemon hair tunneling across her foreheads, mint eyeshadow and collars still lingering on the roofs of our mouths. Oswald, paper punched 7 times, his body reddening, would curse us as fools of art if the flag were not stuffed into his mouth like a gag. Social capital and the introduction of the vanilla egg. When I was in the Guggenheim, there were Picasso sketches, these quick contour sketches. And about 60% of them were known, and about 40% they found in private collections that had never been shown before, which is a pretty extraordinary number of pieces that hadn't been shown. I loved Picasso growing up. And that's how I started out as a visual artist. So the quick contour drawing is something extraordinary, and you kind of lose your body, and it's all about there's something that comes out, and you're sketching towards something that you're going to paint later when you're stretching canvas. And I can remember being in the Guggenheim and seeing people there who were just as struck as I was by Picasso. But many of those people, again, didn't want to talk. Well, all I wanted was a parlor there where we could all step off and talk about how much we love the artwork together. But the Guggenheim goes up like this, right? And up at the top, you've got this cafe, this overpriced cafe, and you've got some wonderful Kandinskys up there, 2 lovely Kandinskys that I just adore. But on the way up, people had their earbuds in, listening to the Picasso stuff. It's kind of like when you're on the bus and somebody's got their earbuds in, but they're really not listening to anything. When we all got up to the top, everybody left their earbuds in. We all knew that the take was over. But it was like they were scared to take it out, because then what do you have to do? You have to interact with other humans. And again, this was something that struck me in these museum scenarios. Social capital and the introduction of the vanilla egg, after Kandinsky's Small Pleasures and Yellow Cow. A pile of sheep or armful of balloons, dribbling trail of purses opening in unison, unnecessary cane. Dreamsicle scarf corkscrewing the neck, but we distrust Kandinsky's pleasures in the overpriced cafe where the tour ends almost as much as each other. Our headphones still cupping our ears for safety from each other. If I carved with my pen the front leg of Yellow Cow for brisket, would security let me be? Would everyone unplug, order the blue ribs and black hooves halved from me? And after we partook, who would divide the vanilla egg beneath her udder so we could share, all of us share, something sweet? I'm going to read a few more, and I'll answer some questions about fishing or landscaping advice, or how to prune a ficus, whatever you like. Sarah asked for this one. Sentence after Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World. She awoke to an empty house, the corn crib hollow, ladder to the roof untended, the tire tracks ending at the house, the sentence she can't quite finish. So she crawled into the field like a skink to sun, her legs dragging behind her like a tail. She is pink in the dying grass. This is the first spatial poem I've ever written, and LSU put it this way. I'm still not sure if I like it, but they were able to capture the way that I had it in the manuscript, which I do like. I wrote this poem in Rothko Chapel. For those of you who have been to Rothko Chapel in Houston at the Menil, it's a non-denominational chapel. Rothko's paintings in the chapel panels cover all of the walls. It's kind of an octagonal shape going around. But they're unlike a lot of Rothkos that you may be familiar with, that are really bright in color and look more like maritime flags than anything. These are dark, almost black, with just tiny little different shades of gray and white throughout them. So it's a palette interior. It's very simple. There are a few benches on the inside. When I walked into Rothko's chapel, after being at the Menil most of the day, I had this overwhelming presence of Mark Strand there with me. Strand was a close friend of mine, and he had just passed away the year before, and I had the pleasure of being around him at Sewanee every summer for a few weeks. And as persnickety and shitty as he could be, he could also be a really loving and caring person, and he seemed to appreciate me because I wouldn't put up with him. I would call him. And he played poker with us late at night. He was a horrible poker player, which just pleased me to no end. So this is in memory of Mark Strand. But how could you not write about Strand being in that spare place at Rothko Chapel? All silent prayers, and I see you in the confusion of positive and negative space, absence and presence, what is not and what is. Poker late one night with you, clubs and spades, black, suspended, and white. You caught in a bluff, nothing you said, as if bestowing us what was left of you. Dark purple lines at the centers, the creases down your cheeks. A sip of red wine, red Italian glasses, matching red socks, somehow fitting your persnickety simplicity. Like a paper clip made tool by a crow, the biscuit hole in a sheet of dough, one the vehicle for absence, the other absence so aware it embodies, both almost making things whole. The last poem that I'm going to read, I vowed that I was going to read at every reading that I give when I read from this book. I told you a little earlier, I wrote the one elegy to my best friend of 40 years who died of a glioblastoma. When I was in Houston, I came home that day from the Rothko Chapel, and I was staying in the medical district right next to MD Anderson, which is a top, cancer hospital. And I was going to get a beer before I went upstairs and started working on revisions. And right when I walked in the bar, there was this guy with a cowboy hat on who looks at me and goes, "I bet you fish." I said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "Sit down, we're going to drink some whiskey together." I said, "Oh, hell, okay, come on." So I sat down, and it was clear that he had already worked his way through most of the whiskey at the bar. So I had a couple of shots with him, and he was buying the top shelf whiskey, the really, really good stuff, $18, $24 a shot. And I just figured this was some rich oil tycoon's son or something, no idea. I said, he looked at me and he said, I hadn't had a drink in 8 years before tonight. I said, son, what is wrong with you then? He said, I'm dead. He said, I was diagnosed with a stage 4 glioblastoma. I won't live over a year and a half. This was 4 months before my best friend died with the same exact thing. I mean, who could put those two things together? I mean, it was extraordinary that our lives kind of got put together in that way. And I was able to talk to him about my friend. And how does this stuff happen? I don't know. It does, though. So I went upstairs and I drafted this poem, which was after in the beginning, I wasn't sure where it was moving. And then it ended up being really subjective. But it's based on a Tanguy's, a surrealist painting called Le Vue. My view from here. Like a man running away from his tumor, legs fuzzy with speed, skull contorting to the cancer's protean form, a bicuspid plied from the roots, enamel gone, dentin starting to slouch like pudding. Stages 2, 3 lurking on the desert floor below him. Stage 4 suspended behind him like a vodka bottle barked with decades of wax. Like the cowboy last night at the hotel bar who had already drunk his way through the top shelf whiskey, who asked if I fished before I'd slid halfway onto the bar stool. Like his unfettered cough of a confession that these were the first drinks he had knocked back in 8 years. Like the biopsy results he received earlier that day, the hospital bed and gown he refused, the surgery, radiation, chemo, lab rat shit he won't do. Like the 3 phone calls from MD Anderson, his ringtone set to the Jaws theme, while he talked about native cutthroat and his girlfriend sat motionless, her eyes full of agency at first, then dropped to the overwrought fried green tomatoes she wouldn't touch. Like my best friend and fishing buddy of 40 years in his last hour of gurgling, his final movements trying to wipe away his piss as if some primitive reflex awakened by dignity. Like a bass lumbering in deep water at his pond during winter, like his patience twitching a jig all day in hope of one big bite. Like the glioblastoma the cowboy and my best friend shared, the food they could no longer taste, the splinters in their necks, the names of their children lost in pill bottles. Like the me I see now in Le Vue, the gray smudge and outline of something that they never catch up to, no matter how fast they run, no matter how long I wait for them. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer some questions. I ain't real smart, but I'll try. Yes?
How long have you been writing?
This is going to sound odd, but I didn't write my first poem until I was 27 years old. Like I said, I owned a landscaping company. My father died at 18. I was set to go to Northwestern. I couldn't go because my mother was sick. My father died, so I started a landscaping business. Went to school part-time. The landscape business I built up, it was a pretty big success. I was taking classes at night just because I was intrigued with the world. I loved English classes. I had 190 hours, I think. I graduated with 200. I was just taking classes everywhere. Theoretical math, it was amazing. It was just we all should do, or no, we shouldn't take 10 years, but we should all be able to kind of have all this stuff and not think the degree is just fitting in a slot to get some job. You know? And luckily I didn't have to think in that way. You know? I was a hard worker. I worked 50 hours a week. I made good money. You know, I paid my way through college. I never got in debt down. But I thought I was taking an English, a lit class on contemporary poetry, and damned if it wasn't a creative writing class. And I walk in and I recognize the professor. He goes, yeah, we're going to write some poems. I looked at the syllabus. I got my stuff up, and I was walking out, and he talked me into staying, or I never would have written a poem. I wasn't interested in writing creatively, never had.
and I wrote my first poem. And I remember it was about, remember that National Enquirer that had the farmer with the 20-pound grasshopper he was holding up? I wrote some silly poem about that. You know, there was something in that the professor who later became my mentor and a fantastic guy. When I wrote my thesis with him, I would go and I would slaughter chickens and we'd cook chicken. I mean, it was just this wonderful experience. He just understood me and I understood him. He was a Kansas farm boy, I was a farm boy. But I worked my way through that semester and I knew then that I wanted to write poems. But again, I didn't know that I shouldn't be an academic. This is the most absurd thing on this planet that I teach. I didn't see this coming.
Yeah, so I also have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Your last poem that you read,
Yeah.
just touching you, by the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. How do you stand before all of us and share those intimate moments with us without cracking or wavering, just being so strong in the song?
I've read that poem quite a few times now. The most difficult time I read that poem was to my best friend's wife and kids. And now I could. We had a ceremony again over that. That poem Lures that I wrote somehow got picked up in Poetry magazine. You know, and I was able to call them and say, guess what? This country boy got this poem in this great magazine that published T.S. Eliot, Marianne Moore, and da-da-da-da-da. How did I do it just now? I couldn't look up at you that much. You know, if you maybe noticed, I had to slow down and speed up. There are certain techniques that you learn so that I don't mind crying. It doesn't bother me a bit. It's a poem I want to get through, so I get through. Yes.
Could you talk about how you approach writing about other people's artwork, especially things that are famous and well-known and kind of a lot of people like they know all of us for those who need to be writing about?
Yeah. How do I approach other people's artwork?
How do you approach writing about other people's artwork?
I don't go in with any preconceived notion, number one. I allow myself to, again, stretch the canvas around whatever will strike me. I decided that from the very beginning. I'd read some contrasting poems that I felt like stayed within the canvas at their own detriment, you know. Merely talking about the content, not thinking about perhaps what happened before the encapsulated moment or after, without allowing those kinds of wonderful subtexts and underlayments and underbellies and frictions and viscosities to start happening. So they stayed within that little space. I knew that I wasn't going to do that. And it wasn't just because of the audiences that I've talked about, but I've read so many that I thought were just, that they had potential to be great poems and just weren't. And I'm not saying that I wrote great poems, but I knew I wanted to take a different approach. Also, the paintings that, Christina's World is probably the most famous painting that I wrote about. I mean, I've wrote about a lot of famous painters, but many of the paintings that I loved growing up that I looked at in picture books or on computer screens, once I got in front of them, it was almost like I knew too much about them already. And I wasn't that interested in writing about them. I would spend time drafting, and when I draft, I write language on one side and I sketch on the other. I'm such a visual writer that I actually have to, if I'm going to have a scene in a park, I have to put the jungle gym here, a tree here, the squirrel here. I have to see it visually before I can kind of work it out through language. So yeah, I would go up to these wonderful paintings that I loved and I thought I would write about, and they just didn't strike me. Some of the early Rothko struck me. The stuff that's more conceptual really struck me. These quick contoured line drawings, right? These tiny little poems that kind of emerged out of it. I would, again, my advice would be to go in with your mind completely clear and allowing whatever subjective stuff can come in and out, whatever's around it. Don't discount it, and don't merely think that you're going to write about that painting. There are lots of poems that spawned out of this that weren't even fit for this book because it lost the painting completely through revision. The painting was the leaping off point, and then the painting disappeared and it became something else. There's beauty in that as well. So I think one mistake that I didn't make is trying to create poems that remained ekphrastic poems. So for this new collection, I have probably 15 poems that started out in the painting and then worked their way out of the painting. Yes? What's that?
What's your favorite fish was?
Oh, God, what a loaded question. My favorite type of fishing is fishing the grass flats in Steinhatchee, Florida for redfish and speckled trout, topwater. So I use skitter walks, I fish topwater all day long, and I'm just pitching skitter walks, probably 1,000 casts a day. I used to fish tournaments too, so, and I was a poker player that supplemented my income in poker. So it's all about mathematical variance in both of those instances. It's about getting the lure out there, it's about hitting the right spot, and it's about flirting with the fish. A lot of times you'll have redfish, it'll come up and nose the bait, but they won't hit it, you know? And what you're doing is you're tricking a redfish that has kind of a downturned mouth and feeds on crabs and even has crunchers back there to go to the top water and swat at something that it shouldn't really be able to do. I love that kind of fishing. I love fishing for yellowfin tuna. I love fishing for tarpon. I love fishing for permit. I love king fishing with light tackle. I love digging huge grouper off the bottom. But, you know, any day of the week I can step in my backyard and go to the Cahaba River and I can wade through and catch red-eyed bass that big, and I'm a kid, you know, and I'm just as happy with it. I went to grad school in Florida so I could fish 3 days a week. That tells you everything. 70 miles to either coast, and believe me, all the old salts down the coast knew me and I knew their numbers, so she can attest to that.
He's not lying.
I would work, the reason that she would see me in there working, and it wasn't just 8, she might see me at 8, it was 6 till 5. I would hold office hours at 6:15. My students would show up in their jammies. Because they said, I've never seen the campus. I said, like hell, then office hours at 6:15, you'll see it then. Nobody will be around, it'll be beautiful. But it was because I would go fishing. So I'd work my tail off just like I did when I had my landscaping company. You work 10, 12-hour days for 4 days a week or 5 days a week, then you can sneak off and go fishing. I used to go north of Manitoba and musky fish. I used to love to do that too. Now I'm just a poor damn academic. I can't do anything. Made twice as much money cutting grass than I did teaching. Yes. Oh, yes.
So you have 3 brothers?
Yes.
Are you the third?
I'm the third. Are you a psychologist?
No, I'm the third. You know, 4
Yeah.
brothers.
And we were pretty spread out too. So I've got brothers that are 10 and 11 years older than me, or one's passed away sadly, and one who's 6 years younger than me. So we were this. So you know, I'm 50 years old, so this was kind of the mid-70s, and my teenage brothers, you know, were 6, 7 years old. My brothers, you know, young. But when I was 8 or 9, we had this odd amalgam of everything happening at one time. Yes.
So is there anyone or anything you feel like you need permission to write about?
I've asked people permission to write about them, yeah. And some experiences with my mother in her childhood. My mother lost her mother when she was born. She bled out. And my grandfather was in World War II. Her mother had only known my grandfather for 3 months. Got pregnant, went off to war like happened to so many people. And she grew up with her great-grandparents in Paducah, Kentucky. And she had a story, and she said I could share this, but she had a story where I was just asking her questions, which had a story about her meeting my father, too, my great-grandfather. But she said, I remember the first time when I heard the name Greta, and I realized that Greta wasn't me. It was her grandparents had named her after her mother. So they lost their own daughter, and then were pretending almost that my mother was their daughter they had lost, and named her Greta too. She was 5 years old. when she was in a bedroom and she was listening to them, and she said, that's not me. So this idea of identity, and I still am not sure how to write about this. I think it's meant to be an essay. I hope you can get a little older. But I had to ask some really difficult questions about her child. And yes, I asked her permission. I've asked permission of my wife. But she's a writer. And she understands that poets are, the great thing about being a poet is we're liars and we steal. Persona. Yes?
Where did you originally want to go to school, or before you said that, the reason why you ended up going to school was because you're on the same you want to go to school?
Oh, gosh. This is so wild. I mean, my mother was from Chicago. My father, just a country boy in Birmingham, Alabama, a bricklayer. And she came down at 15 years old and went to this little Baptist suitcase college called Stanford University. She finished school 2 years early because she had to live with her stepmother and 3 kind of wicked stepsisters who treated her like hell. She went down for her grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary, emancipated herself and enrolled in college and met my father. So she came from Chicago. She was walking to the Piggly Wiggly on the 4th of July to get tampons. So tampons are in my life in a way that I can't understand. She said he was sitting over there on the porch. He had his shirt off. He had a cowboy hat on. She looked over and she heard this, "You want to ride?" She said, I looked at that man and I'd never seen anything like that even in the movies. She said, how could I say no? That's how she met my father. No one else is a suitcase college. Everybody went home. She had nowhere to go during the holidays, so she just had to stay home. So met my father. He was 8 years older than her at the time. So I was set to go to Northwestern because her father owns a family-owned newspaper that we've had for 160 years in Chicago. He was grooming me to take over the newspaper. So I was going to go to Northwestern, study journalism, and then get my MBA, and then slip right in. Boy, I'd have been a miserable cuss. That ain't me. But that's what I thought I needed to do. And everybody was happy about that. So, blue-collar background. He's going to be the one that does things. He's going to be the one that gets the fancy degree. But thank God that didn't happen. I mean, there's some horrible tragedies happened to my family in a very short time. But I couldn't have done this. I wouldn't be the father that I am if I wouldn't have gone through that kind of stuff. I wouldn't be the teacher that I am if I wouldn't have gone through that. I take my students to Poetry Survival Weekend where we build primitive shelter and we trot line and we teach them how to cut wood and split wood, and then they get nicknames based on their natures. So I'll study them for 2 days, and then I'll look out the indigenous critters on the property and they'll get nicknames. You are crawdad. You are flathead. You're Trillium. How could I do that in the middle of Chicago? My God. Bless. Anything else? I can take one more. You can ask me about my fashion style. I did wear a collared shirt. I only have about 3 collared shirts, but I'm brought one just for my friends. I wouldn't embarrass them. It's tough to wear a t-shirt in Minnesota, too. I learned that the way. Well, thank you for coming.